Hey, I'm Don with Oxford Guitar Supply. We wanted to make a quick video on some of the most common questions that we get day to day. Probably the top question we get is, what exactly do I need to finish my guitar? The quick answer is about 5 to 6 cans, depending what color you're doing. We have finishing kits that kind of spec out what cans you need for you. But generally you want 1 can for your base layer, whether that's a sealer or a primer, a can of your color of choice, and about 2 to 3 cans of clear. Anything less than 3, you have a real risk of kind of burning through on the edges. If you're looking at doing a relic kind of finish job, some people really favor that, so you can probably get away with 2 cans of clear. But if you want kind of that factory finish, I recommend 3. If you're using a spray gun, I usually tell people just to go with a quart of clear. It's a little bit better value. It's going to be way more than you need, but rather than buying 2 or 3 8 ounces, it just makes sense. You'll also probably want an 8-ounce can of either sealer or primer and an 8-ounce can of your color of choice. If you're doing an opaque or transparent color, you'll probably just need a sanding sealer. And if you're doing a metallic color, we also recommend a can of white primer. When comparing kind of the contents of our aerosols versus our canned lacquer, it's pretty straightforward. Generally, an aerosol has kind of an internal net weight of 12 ounces. That's kind of made up of about 6 ounces of lacquer, which is actually quite a lot compared to kind of like the industry standard. A lot of companies use about 4 or 5 ounces max. We try to allow the most lacquer in there so you kind of get the most, bang for your buck, but also allow for a good viscosity when spraying out. The other 6 ounces is made up of the solvents and air pressure inside. So with that in mind, you've got about 6 ounces of lacquer here, and compared to our 8-ounce cans of lacquer. These will allow for about 3 to 4 coats when spraying, kind of depending how heavily you're applying them. These can be sprayed as is, but most people prefer to thin them with lacquer thinner about 20 to 40%, which will allow you, 5 to 6 coats. So you get about a third more lacquer in these, so you do get a little bit of a better value if you're using a spray gun setup. For our base coats and our clears, we also offer quart can options, which again just offer a bit of a better value. Another question that we often get asked is if our project needs grain filler or not. If you have a closed grain wood like basswood or alder or maple, you won't need grain filler because the grain is so tight. If you have an open grain wood like ash or mahogany or carina, you have a lot more kind of larger grain patterns. So we recommend doing application of grain filler, sometimes even 2 applications before you move on to your sealer or primer coats. It's basically the consistency of peanut butter, and you kind of just massage it into the surface, let it dry, and then you sand and kind of buff it off, and that just creates a really nice surface for your base layers to sit on. People often ask us if they can just refinish over an existing finish. With the exception of a few oil finishes, usually the answer is yes. If you're just going over top of like an old poly finish or something, you just want to give your guitar a new color. Usually what I'd recommend is just, remove all the hardware and scuff sand everything to like 320 or 400 grit. Just make sure it's super nice and consistent. You don't have any gouges or scratches in it. And then wipe everything down with either naphtha or mineral spirit just to make sure it's nice and clean. And from there, you're basically under your usual finishing schedule. You got your base coats, sealer or primer, depending what you're looking at doing, your color, and your clear coats. The only thing about finishing over an existing finish is you're kind of negating some of the general reasons that people would want a nitro finish. You're getting a really thick finish because you've basically got 2 versions on there. So you're kind of losing the thinness of just a real stripped down nitro finish, so the resonance isn't going to be as prominent. But you don't have to go through the whole stripping of the original finish and the heat gun methods, and you can go on YouTube and find out all the different ways to remove an existing finish. But if you're just looking at sprucing it up, yeah, I would just scuff sand it and basically proceed down your usual finishing route from there. We have two different options for base coats. One is a white primer and one is a transparent sanding sealer. They both have about twice the amount of solids in them compared to other lacquers. So when you're spraying it on bare wood, they're creating that base layer much faster. Because if you were just to put like a tinted lacquer right on top of the wood, the dyes, the pigments in the lacquer are going to absorb at different rates and you're going to have a really blotchy look. So usually you're spraying about 3 to 4 coats on top of the wood, letting it dry overnight, and then wet sanding it, which gives you a very nice level base for your color coats. Sometimes we get questions about cans that are spitting. There's a few reasons that this can occur. One of the main reasons is that they're just not being shaken enough. There's an agitator in there, and basically, especially if you have a metallic color or something that's really opaque, there's a lot of solids in there, and they're just going to settle down to the bottom of the can even if they're put up for a day. But if they're put up for weeks, you know, they're really going to settle out. Sometimes people get excited when they get it, you know, they give it a shake and then they want to see what it looks like. But in reality, you should be shaking it for about 60 seconds once you hear that agitator rattle. Another reason is that they need to be kept at about a room temperature setting. It doesn't have to be exactly room temperature, but if you're keeping it out in a cold garage for months on end or a really hot area for months on end, the main thing that I would say is just let it come up to room temperature and stay there for a few hours so that the viscosity and everything else just has kind of a chance to settle out and come back to natural. Another thing is that when you're spraying, make sure you're pressing the tip directly down centered and not kind of forcing it back or forward. Sometimes you can get a little bit of a buildup of paint right on the collar of the can here. And if that happens, you know, you can just stop and rotate the tip a little bit to a clean area, or just take a paper towel and quickly just wipe the paint away. Another thing that sometimes you might not notice that you're even doing is you might have your finger extended. And especially with the wide fan pattern, that paint can hit the tip of your finger and then in turn cause droplets to fall on your finish. Probably the main thing that causes any kind of spitting or droplets that people kind of don't really think about, and it's kind of down to a technique thing, is that you always want to start and stop your spray pass off of the guitar. So I would depress the tip here, spray, get past it, and then release it. And then same thing, start it, go across your piece, and stop it. And continue your entire piece that way. If anything's gonna spit a little bit, it's because when the compressed air is coming out, you know, there's a small amount of paint in the orifice there, and that's gonna cause a tiny amount of spit, and you don't want that landing on your instrument. We generally don't recommend heating up our cans. Some people like to do that to increase the pressure inside of the can. We formulated these to be the correct viscosity. As long as you're spraying at a room temperature setting, the viscosity and pressure within the can is kind of intended for guitar finishing with our nitrocellulose lacquer. So you should be fine there. You shouldn't have to heat up the cans. When you do heat them up, it increases the viscosity and pressure, and sometimes that can just, you know, be a little bit too much pressure, and you could potentially end up with spitting. Finally, if the tip has already been used once and you've come back to do another coat, you know, an hour later or whatever, there's likely going to be a little bit of built up dried lacquer on the tip. So generally what I recommend to people is just give it 1 or 2 quick shots of lacquer to kind of get that orifice back open and flowing. Make sure it's, you know, giving you a nice spray pattern, and then move back to spraying your instrument. Also, sometimes people ask us about our aerosols and if they can use aftermarket tips. You can sometimes, but generally the orifice on our aerosol cans are quite a bit larger than most of the other cans out there. We spec these specifically to allow for more flow, you know, to better kind of mimic the flow from a spray gun. So more lacquer and, you know, air pressure is coming out through these cans. And as such, your spray tip needs to have that much wider of a kind of spray tip base to fit into the orifice. So if it's off of just most aftermarket tips out there, you might see paint coming up kind of from the base of the stem. You definitely don't want that dripping onto your project. So I would always kind of test on a piece of scrap just to make sure it's compatible. But, we also do sell our aftermarket premium tips. We have 3 different sizes. We have a standard kind of fan pattern, an extra wide fan pattern, and a conical tip as well, which is great for, burst patterns in tight, kind of harder to reach areas, like cutaways, peg heads, things like that. People often ask us if they really need to wait 4 full weeks for their finish to dry before they can, begin wet sanding and buffing. And you can start wet sanding after just a couple weeks if you want. The thing is, as over time, the lacquer is going to continue to off gas and settle into the wood, and you can get that mirror flat shine after a couple weeks, but months down the road you still might end up with some of that grain texture showing through. Whereas if you wait for kind of a full 4 weeks before you're wet sanding, more of the solvents will have, evaporated in that time, and your mirror flat kind of shine should really kind of take and be more of a permanent look for your instrument. The trend of relicking in guitar has really kind of come to prominence over the past decade, and we get questions all the time about, will our nitrocellulose weather check, hairline cracks in the finish. To kind of offer this, we came up with what we call our vintage formula clear lacquer. This was based off of a lacquer recipe from the mid 50s that we were able to reverse engineer. It's free of any plasticizers, and it dries extremely hard and thin, which is kind of exactly what you want to, for both the aesthetics of your instrument, but also to allow resonance to come through. As long as it's kind of had, 3 to 4 weeks to dry, what we generally recommend is, putting it in a deep freezer for, overnight, 8 hours, see kind of what that's done to the finish. And if you want kind of a more drastic effect, repeat that for, 2 or 3 8-hour sessions. And generally you can get a really nice kind of authentic looking, vintage weather checked pattern, those kind of parallel lines with the S curves, and kind of just what most people associate with a vintage instrument. And just like instruments from, the golden era, if it's well cared for, it's likely that it won't, weather check if you keep it in, a well controlled climate, temperature and humidity is all kind of controlled. It should stay, really pristine looking and doesn't have as much of a chance of cracking. But if you want to induce that by, subjecting it to sub-zero temperatures, it's very easy to replicate that look.